All right, so we may be slightly more than 11 minutes today because we got a lot to cover. I want to kind of give an introduction to these atonement theories and how to think about each one. So I call this the A's of atonement because there's like one key theologian who represents each of these, and they all start with the letter A. It's very handy. So at the beginning of this sheet, you'll see some atonement theory critique. 4 things to think about. When any time somebody's saying, this is how Christ's death on the cross saves us, ask these kind of 4 questions. Portrayal of God. What does the theory imply about God and God's motivations in redemption? 2, the problem of sin. What is the nature of the problem that needs to be overcome? Is sin defined narrowly? Does it leave off the experience of some people? 3, Jesus is the model for self-sacrifice and suffering. What is the relationship between Jesus' self-sacrifice and human self-sacrifice, and between the value of Jesus' suffering and perhaps the value of human suffering? Speaking of Jesus' suffering as a model of patient endurance can lend an aura of the holy to all suffering and torture, which is not something we really want to do. And 4, justice as retribution. Is this speaking of the saving significance of Jesus' death as a retributive, punitive understanding of divine justice? So we're going to kind of look at these atonement theories through those lenses. So we're going to start with the penal substitution theory. So the atonement theory widely associated with St. Augustine is this penal substitution theory, or just substitution atonement theory. It's probably the most common people have. It's really prominent, especially in North American Christianity among evangelicals. If you turn on Christian radio, you will hear, if you listen for an hour, you will hear at least one song that comes out of this idea of the cross. In fact, many churches and groups require Christians to believe in this specific model of atonement. In some schools, you have to sign a pledge. If you want to teach there, I believe in the substitution theory of atonement. They're rigid on this. Yet it is the theory open to the most of these 4 critiques, among others. Here you go, Claudia. You know, I can just email you these every week if you want. This theory is used more to describe Christ's work on the cross in youth talks, in metaphors, and in common faith discourse, which has led to very troubling results. It is the view of radio preachers and Christian bookstores, songs, bumper stickers. Some of the songs we sing, especially contemporary, have it, though I try to discourage their use here somewhat. Like one of the most common is this new song, In Christ Alone, where it says, the wrath of God was satisfied. When we've sung it here, I've changed the lyrics, because you don't want to have on the cross, the wrath of God was satisfied. So on the cross where Jesus died, the wrath of God was satisfied. That goes against everything I just said in there. So I make them change the lyrics when we do that one. So here's a quick summarization of this model. Penal substitutionary atonement theory can be described fairly simply, which is part of its appeal. The atonement problem is that 1, a holy God cannot look on sin. That's wrong, but it's there. Holy God cannot look on sin. That's what they think. 2, humanity, totally depraved, is utterly covered in sin. The penalty for sin is death. There can be no peace between God and sinful human beings unless the penalty for breaking God's laws is paid. God's holiness makes both God's wrathful response and the payment of the death penalty necessary. It's like if you're a holy God and you said this is the rule, you can't be like, no, change it. Someone's got to die here. So Jesus dies in our place, bearing all human sin and becoming the substitutionary human object of God's just wrath directed toward human sin. The saving effects of Jesus' death are applied to those who believe that Jesus paid the penalty for their sins. Those who believe they are forgiven will not suffer eternal death, the ultimate penalty for sin, but will live in heaven forever with God after they die. That's the basic thing. God has a rule, don't sin. We broke the rule, we sin. Someone's got it, you have to have a punishment. Jesus says, all right, I'll be the whipping boy. He takes it all for us, and we are spared the punishment. It's like, a tale of 2 cities. Somebody steps in for the other. It's basically we're substituted out, Jesus is substituted in. There's several things wrong with this idea. One is being God can't look upon sin. Now, if you go back, if you've been to 11-minute lessons the last several weeks, what is the primary revelation of God? How do we best understand God? Through what? Jesus. Remember, because Jesus is God. So we should start with Jesus. Now, did Jesus ever look upon human sin? Did Jesus ever be close to human sin? Did Jesus ever eat with sinners? Yeah, so Jesus can do that. How can we then say God can't look upon human sin or be in contact with it if Jesus can? That makes no sense. I remember when I was a kid. I wasn't a kid. I was in high school. Still kind of a kid. I was at this youth camp, and it still sticks out. The speaker talked about how, because of sin, we're like children covered in vomit. And, God just can't be in contact with us. We have to be washed clean first before God can hold us. And so that's what being forgiven is washing the vomit of sin away so God can embrace us. And I remember making the point, and I wasn't all that smart back then, but I said, just going to throw this out there. I remember when I was sick one time and threw up, my mom still took care of me and hugged me even before I got all cleaned up and was perfect and pristine. Now, if my mom can do that, why can't God? The analogy breaks down. So let's look at this theory with the critique of these questions. So the penal substitutionary theory says the necessity of violent punishment in the heart of the being of God. Divine wrath emerges more strongly than divine love as the triggering motivation for Jesus' death. For God appears to be satisfied only with innocent death. So the primary attribute is God needing punishment. How is this God different from the other gods who demand sacrifice, except that God sends God's own Son? And maybe a different person suffers, but the necessity of suffering is still in the very heart of this God, of the gods of the Aztec and the Mayan who demand human sacrifice. It's still demanded. What makes our God much different then, if that's still at the heart of God's being? Is it more comforting or less comforting knowing that God sent God's own Son, God's self, to die in order to appease an angry God? And all people said, I don't want to believe in a God who would commit this kind of child abuse. It's a valid point. If there's a whole other theological idea of the will of God that sent Jesus to the cross, the same will in Jesus that went to the cross. That's a whole other thing. But it's still this idea of someone has to suffer. I'll send my son. Somebody has to do this. Keeping clearly in mind that Christ is not a victim, but a volunteer in this idea only helps it a little bit. In too many homes, children or spouses have volunteered to become the target of a parent's fury to protect someone else in the household. And though we might laud that child, it's still not good, and it's not great of the parent. And then we can end up lifting that up as heroic self-sacrifice in the image of Christ. If we do, then why would they ever leave that situation? Because their present response is Christ-like. This has happened to more women. It may seem like it's impossible. It happens a lot, where they've been told, you should stay in this abusive relationship. This is your cross to bear. You can take the brunt of the punishment. You're being Christ-like. Suffering is salvific. And you may think that would never happen. Oh, it happens a lot. I have a book in my office called A Testimony in Ashes that details some of these stories. And to read them is heartbreaking. I hear it so often. I just heard it recently on the radio when a woman was asking on the Christian radio, should I leave my spouse who's been abused? Like, no, your job is to stay with your husband no matter what. And just take that pain. This is where theology can have real world, very difficult implications. Just the language we use of whether suffering is salvific, it's sacrifice. Well, child, well, wife, well, husband, whoever, stick it out, take the pain. It's good for you. It's salvific. It's Christ-like. And we don't always think how that language can be impactful. I have another book called Crosstalk, where I got the name of this, but it kind of details how a lot of these theologies have actually impacted and raised statistics of domestic violence. There's more domestic violence in churches that adhere to this kind of theology than other places. There's a link there. So theologians will also argue that all persons of the Trinity have one will. And so you don't really have this one against the other Father sent the Son. But that is hard to grasp, and that often isn't presented as part of substitutionary atonement. So there's some things you can kind of do to fix it, but it's usually not shared, so it still feels like when it's presented, God sent the Son to suffer for somebody else. So there's nothing wrong with us sending innocent people to suffer either to save others. We're being Christ-like, we're being God-like. It's a good thing to do. That rhetoric has been used throughout history. This model also makes the redemptive efficacy of Jesus' death seem oddly disconnected from the substance of his life and ministry. If the whole thing of salvation is just that he had to take the punishment and die on this cross, what was the point of his life? Was he born just to die? Did his preaching matter? Did what he do matter? Did his rising, did his resurrection even matter? If the whole thing is just to be able to take God's wrath, the only thing that's important about Jesus is his death. I don't think that's true. That's why I always talk about, if you notice, I talk about being saved by Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. I always name all three. Penal substitution theory can obscure the fact that Jesus' death was the consequence of his fidelity to God's reign and his unswerving pursuit of truth-telling and acts of healing that testified to that reign. No account of the saving significance of Jesus' death can stand if it implies that it was a little more than an arbitrary deal struck between two persons of the Godhead to solve the sin problem. We all had a role. The world had a role. Jesus' actions had a role in this. It wasn't a horror demanded by God to balance a heavenly ledger. As I said in the sermon, it's the natural cost of the conflict that happens. Jesus said, here's the way of God. I'm going to tell the truth. I'm going to heal people, and that got me in trouble. But I'm going to keep doing it because I'm going to be faithful to who God is, and if that gets me killed, so be it. It's more like Martin Luther King, who said, I'm going to keep preaching and proclaiming this. I know I'm probably going to be killed for it, but it's bigger than me. I hope it doesn't happen, but it might. But I have to keep being who I am, have to keep saying what I'm saying. And if I die, I die. That's more the picture we get in the New Testament sometimes. So other issues to think about. Is sin seen here as more of an individual problem based on more modern notions of legal culture? It doesn't become this kind of world thing because each of us have a problem. God took the place of each of us individually. Sin becomes more personal, less corporate. What role does the resurrection play except, oh, hey, see, it wasn't so bad for him to take your punishment. At least he got to live again. Smiley face. How is it that Christian life should be patterned after the life, death, and resurrection of Christ if it was just a kind of legal transaction once and for all deal? Because we're told Jesus is our childhood pattern. Jesus is the pattern we live our life. If this was just a one-time thing, should we not follow that example of heroic self-sacrifice of standing in for another? If not, then what was the point of his life? How do we pattern our life after his? God appears more concerned with upholding the law than for God's children, and that we are pardoned by Christ's death, but is the problem really fixed except that we're just forgiven? The problem still exists, sin still exists, death still exists. It's just that God can now say, I forgive you. But the problem's still there. If a husband is abusing his wife, and then eventually the wife's able to forgive the husband, does that fix the abuse? Once if it still happens, but now he knows that he's forgiven. The problem's still there. So this model doesn't actually do anything to solve the larger problem. Why is it that God cannot look upon sinful humanity? As we mentioned, doesn't God throughout the Bible engage with sinful humans, hear their cries, speak through them, speak through sinful prophets, use a sinful king named David? If Jesus is God, then God eats with sinners. So that makes no sense. Finally, the world of substitution is the impersonal world of replaceable things. When a part of a machine wears out, a new part can be substituted. Representation, however, belongs in the world of persons and personal relationships. The representative stands in for us provisionally, but does not divest us of responsibility. Parents can represent their children until their maturity, when they are able to speak and act for themselves. The atoning work of Christ is more faithfully and understandably interpreted as an act of personal representation rather than the work of a mechanical substitution. So representation and substitution can seem similar, but they're actually very different. I touched a little bit on that in this sermon. I basically talked about substitution, then changed to talk more about representation and more of an ontological theory of atonement, which we'll talk about next week. But that was really like a semester's course in like 5 minutes. So it gives you the basic ideas, but doesn't explain how that works. Next week, we'll talk about a guy named Athanasius, what's kind of called the ontological theory of atonement, which is more about fixing us at the level of our very being. So it's not just a forgiveness, we're all good. It changes the fundamental being of who we are, the sin, the death that attaches itself to humanity. So Athanasius was a guy around Augustine's time. He wrote something called the Athanasian Creed, which was kind of a precursor to the Nicene Creed. He also is famous for taking notes at the Council of Nicaea, in which he details how a guy named Nicholas from Turkey punched this other guy named Arius in the face because Arius didn't believe Jesus was the full Son of God. That Nicholas from Turkey is, you guessed it, Santa Claus. So you better watch out. You better not cry. You better not say Jesus isn't God, because he'll punch you in the eye. I made that up myself just now. So next week, ontological theory of atonement. We'll also then eventually look at the Christus Victory model with a guy named Alain, the kind of moral example with a guy named Abelard, and some others. So next week, ontological theory. Any questions, comments, snide remarks on Augustine and substitution? If you want to learn more, read more, I can share lots of books with you. Thank you very much.